Our first substantive argument is that a completely open source world restricts people's freedom and violates their basic rights. Two layers of analysis. Our first is that open source software leaves innocent users vulnerable to malicious breaches and robs them of their choice to opt out. In the status quo, the majority of software is open source, so the majority of side propositions' impacts are currently existent. However, a world in which everything is essentially required to be open source violates users' choice, forcing them to be vulnerable to malicious features and vulnerabilities if they want to use software at all. User protection and freedom of choice is the key principle that this debate boils down to. The government should be protecting people's freedoms and not limiting them. So with that, it is essential for us to note that open source software carries great risks. This risk materialized in full force with the Equifax data breach in September of 2017. The hack exposed extremely personal information of 143 million individuals due to a severe vulnerability in the open source Apache Struts library. The vulnerability was disclosed in March 2017, but the Equifax system in question was not patched until late July, over 4 months after the breach was discovered, leaving even more users vulnerable and exposed. With open source software, malicious users can view software and exploit any vulnerabilities due to the open source code, including spying on users, restricting users, backdoors, and imposed upgrades. In the world of the proposition, there's no other alternative for users, and the only way for them to be able to use any kind of software is for them to knowingly expose themselves to vulnerabilities that they may or may not feel comfortable doing. That's principally preposterous because it does not uphold any sort of user freedom, which is a democratic value that needs to be preserved. But our second layer of analysis is that open source software violates people's intellectual property rights. Assume there's an open source product where developer 1 acting in good faith adds a contribution which infringes upon intellectual property right holders' copyright or patent. Developers can actually violate copyright by copying, modifying, and distributing the infringing source code contribution, which happens all the time. Developers infringe patents by making, marketing, and selling patented inventions embodied in the infringing contribution. The recently much debated legal cases against large Linux users are perhaps the best examples of how intellectual property rights can be used as a strategic tool against particular software users. Open source and distributed components-based software development methodology in general highlights the risk of potential third-party copyright and patent infringements. For example, open source risk management, who sells intellectual property right insurances, claims that Linux kernel could infringe upon almost 300 different patents. That's exploiting users' intellectual property rights, and that's a breach of democratic values. But the violation of intellectual property rights is made even more visible in the fact that many open source community developers campaign visibly against stricter intellectual property legislation. Many developers have warned that software patents and increased proprietary control threaten the functionality of the open source model unless they don't do anything about protecting their users' intellectual property rights. And this is because, at the end of the day, users' choice and user freedom and users' intellectual property rights are fundamental to a democratic society that we have no choice but to oppose. Thank you.